TPN, the Sovereign Americans News Network. Spending is set to hit an all-time record high in 2011 at $3.8 trillion. This week, President Obama's budget was brought to the Budget Committee's hearing room with help of mechanical pallet jacks. This scene is a perfect visual representation of just how big, bloated, and overgrown the federal government has become. Yes, I know there is more than one copy of it contained within these boxes, but the visual remains. Now, it has been reported that this budget assumes a $1.1 trillion income. It calls for $1.6 trillion in borrowing. The remaining $1.1 trillion is set to come from new taxes and fees, allowing us to conclude a basic doubling of taxes and/or fees. Inevitably, these will come from the taxpayers/consumers. So, consider that. Then, remember that this budget is from the same president who 1 year ago said this.
I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited by half by the end of my first term in office.
Well, with annual tax increases like this budget calls for, coupled with the supposed freeze, we may be on our way to that goal. But at what cost? Many people believe at the cost of private property and private capital. But year after year, election after election, decade after decade, Americans continue to send these professional politicians to Congress who keep the same insidious topics unresolved cycle after cycle, with word games in exchanges like this.
The issue of deficit and debt is another area where there has been a tendency for some inconsistent statements. How's that? All right? Contrary to the prevailing wisdom in Washington these past few years, we cannot simply spend as we please and defer the consequences to the next budget, the next administration, or the next generation. And our investments to rescue our economy will add to that deficit in the short term. That's why I say, if we're going to frame these debates in ways that allow us to solve them, then we can't start off by figuring out who's to blame. First of all, I suspect that some of those Republican critics have a short memory because, as I recall, I'm inheriting a $1.3 trillion deficit, annual deficit, from them. The previous administration and previous Congresses created an expensive new drug program, passed massive tax cuts for the wealthy, and funded 2 wars without paying for any of it, all of which was compounded by recession and by rising health care costs. By the time I took office, we had a 1-year deficit of over $1 trillion and projected deficits of $8 trillion over the next decade. But I want to be very clear, if the message was not effectively delivered by the 3 previous speakers. This administration has inherited a $1.3 trillion deficit. All this was before I walked in the door. The fact of the matter is that when we came into office, the deficit was $1.3 trillion. When I first walked through the door, the deficit stood at $1.3 trillion, with projected deficits of $8 trillion over the next decade. Most of this was the result of not paying for 2 wars, 2 tax cuts, and an expensive prescription drug program. On top of that, the effects of the recession put a $3 trillion hole in our budget. We cannot and will not sustain deficits like these without end. We are paying the price for these deficits right now. In 2008 alone, we paid $250 billion in interest on our debt, 1 in every 10 taxpayer dollars. That is more than 3 times what we spent on education that year, more than 7 times what we spent on VA health care. So if we confront this crisis without also confronting the deficits that help cause it, we risk sinking into another crisis down the road as our interest payments rise, our obligations come due, confidence in our economy erodes, and our children and our grandchildren are unable to pursue their dreams because they're saddled with our debts. And that's why today I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited by half by the end of my first term in office. Now, this will not be easy. It will require us to make difficult decisions and face challenges we've long neglected. But I refuse to leave our children with a debt that they cannot repay. And that means taking responsibility right now, in this administration, for getting our spending under control. If we had taken office in ordinary times, I would have liked nothing more than to start bringing down the deficit. But we took office amid a crisis. And our efforts to prevent a second depression have added another $1 trillion to our national debt. That, too, is a fact. But families across the country are tightening their belts and making tough decisions. The federal government should do the same.
But the day that the leadership of the military comes to me and says, Senator, we ought to change it, then I think we ought to consider changing it, because leaders in the military are the ones we give the responsibility.
It is my personal belief that allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly would be the right thing to do. We have in place a policy which forces young men and women to lie about who they are in order to defend their fellow citizens.
The question before us is not whether the military prepares to make this change, but how we best prepare it for it.
I'm happy to say that we still have a Congress of the United States that would have to pass a law to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
So as you can see, and most of you know already, Democrat or Republican, there's no difference. And finally, this brings us to a call from Mickey of Waterloo, South Carolina, who expressed his frustrations to Lou Dobbs about our professional politician problem this week with these interesting thoughts.
I think the American voters definitely got their work cut out for them. This is not about party affiliation. This is about a mentality that's been brewing up here for decades and decades on that hill. Best thing that could have happened to us when they had the State of the Union speech was for an alien ship, sit down in that White House, take the whole thing up to some galaxy somewhere else. So our job would be easier. We could vote new people in there. We've got to clean the house the next two elections. We just have to get them out of there.
Well said, Mickey. We couldn't agree more. TPN, the Sovereign Americans News Network.